existence of morality is some like conceptions depends on the mind, I guess.
Yeah, but I think that's only the case outside of a social standard. So if
Okay,
we're
so you're
refer-
saying that without this social standard, morality does not exist.
uh not necessarily does it not exist. I just think if society didn't exist, right, or at least society didn't have so many or no rules, for example, morals would just be based off of individual people. For example, let's
So
say you
you're
had
saying that okay, so you're saying that in the absence of individual people, morality would not exist.
yeah. So let's say like
So so wait a second. So just to make it clear, what do you think morality really is?
I think morality is just what people like, for example, you and me, or just a group of people, or people individually think about certain things. For example, somebody's morality might not let them kill people, somebody's morality might let them kill people. I think that's just what
That
we talk
doesn't that
about
doesn't
when
point that wait a second. So you're saying that people have different moral views. That's not informative. So I asked you what exactly is a moral view? What exactly is a moralistic climate or morality? And you just explained to me that you have different views. Are there people with different views on morality? It's kind of
no
like
no
this.
no,
Let me just give you like a rundown example, right?
yeah.
Just to like clarify. It's kind of like if I ask someone, what exactly is a task of science? What exactly is natural science? If someone say to me that in science there are people with different perspectives on the geography and the history of the universe. That's like explaining what science is, which is the study of the geography and history of the universe, which is one of the first tasks of science as a whole, right? So I'd like you to explain to me what it truly means for something to be good and bad. What do you think it means, really?
No, that's what I was about to get into before you cut me off there. You finish?
Yeah, I'm finished.
All
Wait for
right.
the explanation.
No, I was just saying it's someone's just like principles. It could be anybody's principles based off of what they think.
So you think it's just someone's desires?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, that's incorrect because like it's not based on just personal desires. Like there's several
Right.
situations where one would actually want to steal something. They would want to actually steal something, but they intuit that it is wrong to do it. So obviously morality is based on something independently of just personal desires. There's
Wait,
some
wait,
other
wait, 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 wait.
Mhm.
But why is it wrong to do it? Let's say like me, for example,
Because we
right?
intuit it.
I
Moral intuition is the
wait.
best
Let me
evidence
let
we
me
have
let
for
me
it.
finish. Let me finish with my example here, right? See, inside of society, right? If I were to go to a bank and rob it right now, myself, I think it'd be morally wrong, right? Because I'm in a society that inherently keeps on telling people, right? Stealing is wrong. You go to school, stealing is wrong. Your parents tell you stealing is wrong, right? But let's
Wait,
say
why
we
is that
take all.
actually the reason though?
I think it's just inherently the reason based off of what we're told. I think we're just programmed to think that way. Because I think
I
outside of
mean,
that,
wait a
right?
second, wait a second. So who programs? Okay, so I'm gonna like do like a rundown with you. I'm gonna like do it like this, right? So who
Yeah.
programmed the people who established these rules to believe this?
Who programmed
It could be
those
society.
people?
It couldn't be society because remember, these are the people who dictates what society thinks as based on their standard.
I think those individual people, yes, can have those views themselves. I'm not saying inherently that
Okay, so it is not
everybody.
reduced to just society
Wait.
then.
Let me finish what I'm saying. I'm not saying everybody inherently can get programmed, or that there wasn't somebody who started with their own beliefs or a group of people who had these same beliefs. I'm not saying that that's impossible. I'm
Wait, so
saying
why do you
that
think these
that
people believed it? This the first group of people who supposedly instigated this rule set for morality. Why do you think they believed it?
I don't know. They could believe it for any reason. Maybe they believed it because they didn't want any of their money stolen. They could have believed it based off of the fact that I don't know, somebody in the middle of war, killed their mother. It could be based
Wait,
off of
so they
anything.
believe it because they do. Wait a second. So that's not actually explain the point, right? So you're just inserting these possibilities. It seems to me as if you don't even know what the actual reason behind people believe in this thing to be, right?
I'm
And I
referring
and,
to wait.
and I'll just rebut your point like this, right? It is very pragmatic because even outside of society, right? I don't even like necessarily cohere with majority of not majority, but I don't necessarily cohere with some societal principles which I would disagree on. Like for example, um I don't even need to give an example per se, but the point of the matter is there are certain things, there are certain actions which I see and I just intuit that it is wrong. I just have a feeling that it
Yeah,
is wrong,
but
right?
then inherently
And that
inherently
intuition
it's
and feeling is what it implies to being objective. You
yeah,
understand
but
why, right?
that's it. Then inherently, then it would be inherently wrong, or it'd be inherently subjective in your mind
No, it
because
is not.
somebody what
That's just a category error. You're just conflating the epistemology and the ontology of this thing. So, for
no
example, look at the proposition, or rather, look at how the ancient Greeks. I'm not gonna no, I'm not gonna use this example. I'm gonna use the example where physicists observes like atoms, right? They use like empirical data set of observations, and they use this empirical data set to then observe that every object that we know of is reducible to some atomic particles or something, right? Or even if we look at like how Isaac Newton observed the law of gravity and make his own model of the law of gravity. All of this is based on a subjective process, right? Without him, he could have never known this thing. He had to observe this thing and then make some predictive judgment on what is actually true from what is actually not true of reality as regards science.
wait,
But simply
I think that's
because simply
I,
because wait a second,
yeah.
simply because we know this thing through a subjective methodology does not mean the thing that is being known is subjective. That's a hasty generalization.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Because in that situation, yes, like let's say Newton's laws, right? Obviously, we know Newton's laws of relativity is in fact objective, right? At least in this hypothetical, you know, what is it called? My bad. I have food
Dude, my point
poisoning,
of the
so
matter is you were critiquing me because I told you that the reason as to why I believe this thing is wrong is because of my intuitions. You said, okay, that means it's subjective. No, it's not. It
no,
just
whatever.
means it just means the way in which wait a second. Because this is agreed upon by a majority of moral philosophers. This is why the majority of philosophers in moral philosophers or moral realists, they believe in objective morals. And it is that it is because of the fact of the matter, which is that moral intuitions, regardless of whether it is subjective, it is our best evidence for morality. The epistemology regarding morality is very vague, it's very complex. So that is the
Mhm,
best evidence we have as of now. Maybe in the future, when human society makes a mental progress, we may have a more objective standard for determining whether something is moral or immoral. But our best evidence, as of now, the status quo, is just our intuitions. Us intuiting something to be wrong does not mean this thing is subjective. It just means the way in which we know this thing, which is through intuitions, is subjective.
mhm. Well, here's the thing. Here's the difference here, right? Is I think you're not fully understanding what I'm trying to explain here today. One, I don't necessarily care what all these other philosophers think. Sorry, I kind of going in and out of what you were saying because I have a little bit of food poisoning,
That's
so
not
my
my
nose.
major argument. I'll just make
No,
an
no, no.
appeal to reliable authority. That's not even my argument.
Could you restate it?
My argument, I can repeat my arguments once more. I'll give my own thought experiment. I
Yeah.
actually use a thought experiment. This is a thought experiment I use when I debate objective morals. So I think morality is like dark matter. You know what dark matter is?
Yeah. I know what dark
Well,
matter
yeah.
is.
So just to explain, dark matter is actually something which is not truly observed by scientists. It's like a hypothesized matter, which is used to explain some phenomenon of the universe, which is gravitational matter as we know it. So I think morality is like this, or like an unknown object. Think of like we have a box, right, with an unknown object in. There's like an unknown object in the box. The way in which we know this, there's an object in the box is based on we shake the box, we hear something, we don't actually see the object, we don't know anything about the object really, but we go based off this epistemic appearance, this system of epistemic appearances, like what appears to be the case, what we hear and what we feel, to then make some predictive judgments on what this actual thing is. I mean, these appearances implies that this thing is a part of the external world. This thing is an objective fact of reality. However, we don't have full knowledge on this thing. We can't fully know what this thing actually is. And I think morality is like this. We don't fully know what it is. We can't really define what good and bad is. They're kind of like primitive notions. However, we have some intuitions. We have some system of appearances, which gives us a vague but sufficient idea on what is actually moral from what is immoral. And maybe in the future, we can actually have a solid ground for what is moral from what is immoral. But that is just our current best evidence for morality, which is moral intuitions.
Yeah, well, even using that argument, you're inherently saying that morals can be subjective. I'm not. 100% saying either that what is it called, that everybody can't think the same in a hypothetical world either. But what I'm saying here, Apollo, right, is in your own what is it called? In your own, help me out here. I
It
forget
is
the
not
word.
subjective. That's what I'm saying to you. I'm saying that we having some epistemic access to this thing is what implies it being objective. If epistemic realism is true, then most likely moral realism is also true. You're an epistemic realist because you believe in things such as Newton's law of gravity. You believe that when Newton observed the apple fall into the ground, and then he observed that there's a he observed that there's a regularity within the universe, which implies some law of gravity. You agree that these set of observations imply some objective facts, right? So you also agree that our epistemic system, or rather what seems to be the case, what appears to be the case, is some indication of some objective fact out there.
Mhm.
So it appears to be the case that rape is wrong. It appears to be the case that pedophilia is wrong. These things are things which are apparently the case. We have some intuition that this thing is wrong, which implies this thing being an objective fact of reality. Now, the intuition is a very vague process of knowing this thing. However, it does not illegitimize the thesis of moral objectivism.
But Apollo, which here's the thing, right? And that same thing, right, is even if you go off of that, right? What if I were to say, right? Let's say you, right? What is something you agree is morally correct or morally incorrect? Apollo.
Killing is wrong, for example. I think killing is wrong is an objective moral fact.
Wait. If killing's wrong's an objective moral fact, right? Like, let's look back to when we were cavemen, right? And everything was a lot more, I guess you could say, black and white in a sense, right? We before for a real society, came about. Back then, killing was just normal. Somebody tries to eat your food, for example, you just go and kill that person and
You
take
know
your
your
food back.
argument. You're gonna say that if you're gonna say if back then we intuit that this thing is not wrong, then and we intuit currently that it is wrong, then that implies subjectivity. The reason why
Yes.
that doesn't apply is for several reasons. I'll just like compare more. That just implies more progress. I'll compare this to scientific progress. So, for example, if you look at like the ancient Greeks and like the Iron people of the Iron and Bronze Age civilizations, they believed in an astronomical system which subscribes to a flat Earth theory, and they also believed that the Earth was stationary. They also believed that stars and so on revolved around the universe, or revolved around the Earth, and the Earth was located in the center of the universe. Over time, we realized that this thing is actually wrong due to scientific technology and so on, right? So the scientific technology, this progress in science, is what implies, or right, sorry, what gives us a good reason to reject those theories from the past. So likewise, in the caveman analogy, our intelligence growing during the time at which human beings are also progressing, mentally speaking, would be used as some tool to give us a reason to reject these prior beliefs as regards this thing not being wrong. So the only thing you're explaining is moral progress. You're not actually disproving moral objectivism.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the difference here, right? I think what your analogy is disanalogous, right? Going from like believing into flat Earth to believing in round Earth, or us having the scientific capabilities to go figure that
Um,
out, I think is a lot more different than us talking about our capability to think in the sense of whether or not we believe killing is wrong. Now, what I mean by this is when we're talking about morality, right? We obviously think about what we think is right and wrong and things of that nature, right? So back when people didn't have society, like I was saying before, and they still
people,
thought,
wait, 1 second. How can people not have society back then?
how could people not have society
You
back
understand that
then?
society is a group of people, right? So there's a
Even
collective group of people back then, so
uh,
there's society. It's just it's wait,
ready?
wait a second. Just
Okay,
wait.
let's.
Pause. I'm just saying to you, this just implies that the collective group of people back then had a different views on what is moral from what is immoral. It doesn't disprove moral objectivism. It doesn't disprove that there's an objective moral fact out there. Disagreement on the subject matter is not a good reason for something to be subjective. For example, I can disagree. Like, let's say, for example, I can bring a flat earther in this VC. and me and him have like some discussion, and he disagrees with the Earth being flat, or sorry, the Earth being round, I should say, and I disagree with the Earth being flat. So now we have like a subject matter where there's some disagreement between both interlocutors. This does not mean that there's not an objective fact of reality as regards whether the Earth is flat or whether the Earth is round. It just means that there's some disagreement. Disagreement does not imply subjectivity, so you need a better argument.
Well, the reason why I still apply subjectivity, right, is still the factor that anybody can inherently think, right, that something's different, right, or they don't agree in something, right. That to me still, makes it right so that there's some form of subjectivity. It's still subjective to the person's own mental thoughts and
Oh,
how
you're
they
just
think.
no, dude.
Just
You're just
because.
explaining that the belief. Wait, so I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to interrupt you. You're
Mhm.
only explaining that the beliefs that are being held are subjective. You're not explaining that the subject matter which belief is referenced and is subjective. So, for example, if I have a bottle on the table, or let's say, you know about the refraction of light and all that, right? So, let's say, for example, think of like you have a glass of water on the table and you have a pencil inside of the glass of water. You're imagining it.
Mhm.
Okay, so if I say to someone, or rather, if someone says to me that, hey, the pencil is actually broken, right, because of refraction, because of it's appearing to be the case that it is broken based on what we're seeing, and I say to them, no, it is not actually broken. That's just an illusion based on how refraction of light works and how scientists explain this in physics. Um, we're having a disagreement here. We're having different opinions on the matter. However, it does not mean that there's not an objective fact about this topic. It does not mean that there's no objective fact as regards this. It just means that we are having different beliefs, right? That's just all it implies.
Wait, I think that's just analogous there, right? Because here's the difference, right? In in that same right sentence, right, or same analogy, right? I could say that that person then gives an equally valid argument, or then maybe we're further along in science, right? And now we see that there's other things that come into it. There's I don't know, let's say there's a rock, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be scientifically accurate. Let's say there's a rock, right? Let's say in this rock,
Huh?
it's what's wrong?
I heard you. What you said?
I said, let's say there's a rock, right? Let's say we have a rock. Let's say in this rock, somehow goes against a wall or whatever, right? And then in that case, someone might be arguing, okay, so it is possible to go against our laws, and then someone be maybe arguing against a rock being able to go against the laws, right? Or to certain people, it appears as this rock here is going against the laws. Some other
Okay.
people, it appears that it isn't going against the laws, right?
Okay.
Then it inherently becomes subjective on whether or not these laws are still valid or not,
No, it
right?
does not. No, it does not.
Yeah,
Dude, you're just explaining that the epistemology is subjective. Like, let me give it like another example, right? Okay, so let's see. By the way, which thing do you? Okay, so you believe that the law of gravity is an objective fact, right? You believe that um everything falls to the earth, whatever once it goes
yeah,
up,
I
right?
think that's pretty obvious. Yeah,
Okay, so you understand how we know the law of gravity, right? We know it through a system of appearances. It appears to be the case that this is actually what is occurring, right? Based on our perception, this is
yeah,
case, right? Well, our perception is just reducible to some neurological events in the mind, which um happens to translate some information to make us understand something about reality, right? Our brain is used to then um yeah, understand reality as we know it, right? I mean, all of this is
yeah.
based on some mental neurological processes, but it does not mean that the law of gravity is. All it means is that the way in which we approach this thing is subjective. The way in which we know this thing is through a subjective methodology. It does not mean that the law of gravity itself is subjective. That's a category error in some sense. It's like you conflate in the epistemology of something and the ontology of something. Do
Even
you
in that,
understand now? So it's kind of like morality. Something appears to
yeah.
be the case that something is moral and something is immoral. We use a system of appearances.
Well, in a system of appearances, right? If we're using that same system, right? To go further on that, then if we're using a system of appearances, then I just say that okay, well, if we're using like a system of appearances, then I like to just say that in my own appearance, killing somebody is wrong, or so on and so forth, right? It that same thing, right? Using a system of appearances also means that it just would be inherently changed to whoever sees it or realizes it or thinks about it, right? A system of appearances, wait, sorry, my thing just lagged, would just show that people
Give me
could
a
think
second. I'm
other
gonna do
things.
something.
Yeah.
Was that Shumra's mom who said come over here? Vibes.
Yeah,
How's it going?
I'm good, bro.
Bro, if you win this, bro, give me like perms.
Sure.
Bro, vibes. Was it just me or did I not hear like some African mom say come here in VC?
I don't know. Also,
Um,
Hyde, stop getting your
Back.
hopes up, cause Hyde, stop getting your
Repeat
hopes
the
up, cause
analogy
he's
you've
not
given.
winning.
say it again.
Repeat the analogy you've given.
Oh, I was just saying that if we're using this like same thing, right? That it's just based off of how people view it or perceive it. Then I just still use the same argument that if this
Well,
person,
dude. No, I'm not saying. I'm just saying that the way that she knows something is based on
how you
our
perceive.
mind. Know something without a mind. Like for example, I can't know that there's a rock in front of me without me relying on my mind as some epistemic tool to actually understand what is in front of me and make sense out of reality. So all that's explaining is that the way in which you know something is subjective, not the actual thing that is being known through the subjective process.
Yeah, but here's the thing, right? Even in that same thing, right? If the only way we can know it is based off of how we perceive it or understand things, then it's so
And that goes the
subjective.
the same logic applies to the Newton's law of gravity example. The way she knows this the way that she knows this thing is based on a systematic set of observations, right? This is all based on his mind. However, this does not in any way disprove that this thing is an objective fact of reality.
That's fine, right? But Apollo,
Can't say that simply because it's based on or the way you know this is based on how you view it and how it appears to be the case is a good defeater to it being subjective or sorry it being objective. That's not explaining it being subjective. It's just explaining that we have a subjective process that we go under to then determinately prove something to be true or something to be
as long as
false.
it's
That's all it's explaining.
as long as it's a subjective process for us to get there in the first place, then, and that's the only thing we can go off of our own understanding, then it's still
Thank you
subjective.
very much. You're agreeing with me. That's the only thing we can go under or go off of, the subjective process. So the
Yes,
same applies with morality. The only thing we can go off of to determine whether something is moral or immoral is based on the subjective process of moral intuition.
and if we're doing that, right, a subjective process, then it's still subjective, whether or not that there might or
Dude,
may
you're not
not.
getting the point. Wait,
But
pause. So
mm,
here's like the rundown of this debate, right? You agree the law of
yes,
gravity is an objective fact of reality. You agree that it is based on subjective. Are you? Yeah, sorry. You agree the law of gravity is objective, and you agree that the way in which you know this thing is by going off of this subjective process, which implies this thing to be an objective fact of reality. But then I correlate that with the morality example. The way in which you know this thing is based on how it appears to be the case that this thing is are how reality appears to be the case, right? If
yeah.
it appears to be the case that this thing is moral or immoral, then this system of appearances would imply some objective fact as regards what is moral or what is immoral. And you agree that the subjective process in the law of gravity example does not disprove the law of gravity being objective, but you're trying to use that same logic to disprove
Wait.
morality being objective,
But
which is not a
here's
good
the difference.
argument.
Here's the difference, right? I still believe, right, in that sense, right. Let me reiterate what I mean. I'm not necessarily arguing against a hypothetical possibility possibility of it being objective, right? And it's just still my own personal belief that it is objective based off of my own way of me perceiving it, right? So in the same thing, I'm still agreeing with what I said. It doesn't defeat it, right? I'm still saying it's
Dude,
based off
that's
of
just word
how
salad. So you're lost in the sauce, dude. So basically, you're just
lost in
basically
the
just saying
sauce.
that you're just basically saying that you believe morality to be subjective because I believe it, which is just it's tautology. It's not
No, 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 that's not what I'm
informative.
saying.
Well, that you said like just in a summarized version, right? But
No.
just to explain, I'm just going to give you a tip right here. For it is proved to me that morality is subjective, you have to investigate into the analytic properties of morality and explain why it requires a mind. If you can't explain to me this thing, right, then you can't prove this subjective. And I don't need to explain to you the analytic properties of morality for me to explain why it is objective, considering that we don't actually have to have full or good knowledge, hyper literal or hyper specific knowledge of something for that thing to actually be so objective. Just us having some system of appearances, which implies this thing being objective, is what implies or proves it being objective. That's all I'm explaining to you. So since I've already explained to you why
My thing
morality,
like that. My thing like
yeah,
that.
yeah. So I'm gonna
I didn't
reiterate if
hear
you did
you
not
at all.
hear.
I didn't hear what you said.
If
My
you,
thing like
yeah, I was just saying to you that for you to prove that morality is subjective, to
Mhm.
do some tests. You have to do some like you have to do what we call the counterfactual test in philosophy to explain why it is subjective. Meaning that you have to actually say that okay, so let's say for example pain. We know pain is subjective because we know that without a mental agent, pain possibly can't exist. In all possible worlds, it can't exist, right? If mental agent does not exist, pain can't exist because pain relies on neurological events. We know this through science. However, you can't say to me that morality falls under this category if you can't even explain to me why morality relies on the mind through a counterfactual
Yes, I
test.
can. I can explain why it relies on the mind. What?
I mean, before you even explain that, before we go into this rabbit hole about why it relies on the mind, I've already explained to you why it does not. Because morality is clearly not just based on personal desires. Because there are things which I would personally desire, but I don't actually subscribe to it. I don't believe it to be some objective. Or sorry, I don't believe it to
What?
be a good
That is
action.
so
I believe it to be wrong.
contradictory. Just
It's
because,
not.
just
Wait
because
a
you
second.
won't
That's
follow.
before you just say it's contradictory. You'd have to be begging the question. You have to be assuming that morality is subjective for it to even respond to it by saying it is contradictory, which is what's
No,
in
I
question.
don't. That's not even
Okay,
true.
dude.
Because
Okay,
wait,
listen.
wait, wait.
I'm gonna explain to you what I do. I say to you that there are certain things I desire but believe to be wrong from a moralistic perspective. You're saying that it's contradictory. When you're saying that it's contradictory, you'd have to be presupposing that all moralistic climates are based on desires, right? Which is obviously disproven by my intuition of something else.
No, because you'd actually just be proving yourself wrong, right? Because if you're saying, right,
Because I'm not
that
because
okay,
under my worldview this is not subjective. I'm basically saying that there are things which I desire but I don't believe to be right. Just like for example, there are things that people believe to be right but is not actually right. So that's basically the same thing, right? Obviously truth is not based on beliefs because if it was based on beliefs, right, there's no objective truth, right? So in this case, I'm just saying to you that if there's situations where I desire something but I believe it to be wrong, then obviously it is not based on desires. It is independently of desires.
here's the thing, right? That would make this what you're saying inherently wrong, right? And you're same thing of you saying, right, that what is it called? You said you have desires, right? That you don't act upon because you think it's morally wrong. Am I correct?
Excuse me?
You said you have desires, right? That you don't act upon because you think it's morally wrong, right?
Yes.
Okay. Even in that situation, you'd be proving yourself wrong, right? Because those desires, right, that you want to do is something subconscious to you, right? The reason why you think it's morally incorrect is via our society
Dude, are you
making
listening to yourself? So
yes.
for one, you're already assuming that this is the reason why I believe this, which is not the case, right? I've already asked you to prove this. You have not actually explained why this based on society, and even then, I reduced your moral relativism standard to moral subjectivism, right? Which again, even then, I didn't even investigate as to why exactly these persons individually who created these societal rules would adhere to such principles to begin with. And then I explained to you why it would be based on what appears to be the case from their perspective to be moral and immoral, which would imply some objective fact of morality. So that argument does not work for one. And for two, right, the thing about desires is that, for one, if I, for example, let's see, if I want to believe that, let's say, for example, I watch my two football teams, right? I watch El Clasico, or I watch like Real Madrid and Barcelona playing, and Barcelona. It seems to be the case that Barcelona is going to win, right? I want to believe that Real Madrid is going to win, or Real Madrid is going to turn the game over, but it's
Mhm.
obvious that it is objective that Barcelona is going to win. It's obvious, just based on this example, we can say that the future events of the game is not dependent on what I think or what I desire, but is an objective feature of the world. So to compare that with this analogy, if it seems to be the case, or rather, if I desire to do an action, but even regardless of this obvious desire to do this action, it just seems to be the case that this action is wrong, then that would imply that the wrongness or the immorality of the action is independent of the desire. Because if it was dependent on the desire, then if I desire this thing, I would also think this thing is definitely good. But I don't. There are situations in which we desire something, but we don't actually want to act upon those desires. So that implies it being independent of those desires.
You can have
For your argument
it.
to work, which is more
Mhm.
subjectivism, you'd have to explain to me why morality is necessarily dependent on the desires. Meaning that in all possible worlds, there has to be desires for there to be morality existent.
Right. Here's the thing here, right? My desires is in fact based off of my own moral standards, right? I would, if I desire, right, to have, let's say, I desire to steal from a bank, right? But I don't do it because I know that I'd be sent to jail, right? That doesn't inherently mean that my morals doesn't allow for it. It just means that I know I'm going to be sent to jail and people will look at me
And
different, or
that
just,
doesn't apply to this example. So that just means that you have a different belief that is objective or moral from one that's objectively
and if I
immoral.
have a different
Doesn't it doesn't disprove? Wait a second. It doesn't disprove that morality is objective. You're just saying that in this hypothetical scenario, I have an objective. I sorry. I have like a, let's see. I have a different perspective of what is immoral and what is moral, right? And based on these and consequences, I'm not going to act upon those desires. That does not explain that morality is subjective, because there are cases in which people desire certain actions, right? Or desire to do something, but they don't do this thing, or they don't act upon these desires, not because someone told them not to, not because of some consequences which would go against their other desires, or rather because they just intuit that this thing is right. So that implies that this is not just based on desires, but it is based on something independently of desires, right? So like even the stealing example, someone's stealing like a jewelry that is out on the road or something, right? If I steal the jewelry and no one sees, right? If there's no one around
Mhm.
me and like I don't steal the jewelry, I'm sorry,
You,
I was just distracted for a second. But if there's no one around me, right, and
mhm.
I decide not to steal the jewelry, that is obviously not because of some societal imposition, right? Because there's no one to even punish me for acting upon these desires. It's just a matter of I just intuit this thing to be wrong. It just seems to be the case that I should just not act upon these
Wait,
desires.
before we
And
could,
the
but
actual, yeah, go ahead. You can respond, but I think I just like made my point pretty clear.
yeah,
Um,
but before we even continue, let's talk about this. What do you think is subjective? What do you think like it means to be subjective?
I think to be subjective pain. I think pain is subjective. I think it is
No, no,
confirmed
no.
by
Like, what do
science.
you think is the definition of subjective?
What he said?
What do you
Excuse
think is the
me?
what do you think the definition of
Subjective is
subjective?
that which is necessarily dependent on the mind, that which can't exist if a mind does not exist.
I think there's like more to it though. I think like inherently with the mind, like I think
Definition of
just
subjectivity in philosophy.
subjectivity is based off of like personal thoughts and feelings.
That's pretty much what I said, but in different
Yeah.
terminologies. So
Okay, that's right.
it's something
I'm
that
just
it
making.
it's yeah.
I'm just
So without, so excuse me, hold on. without thoughts and feelings, this thing just can't exist, basically. If you're fine with that definition.
Say it again.
So just to like accommodate your definition, I'm just gonna like phrase mine in a different way to suit your perspective of what subjectivity is. Right? So subjectivity would just be that which can't exist independently of what we think and feel to be the case. Better?
Wait, you said that so fast and I got
Example, the law of
distracted.
gravity. This is not subjective because even if we did not, or even if there was no agent to think on or think about the law of gravity, it would still exist nonetheless. It's just a law of nature, right? You understand that?
Well, even with what you're saying, Apollo, it would still just go back to what I was saying about what the definition, which is what I wanted to go into about the definition of
Just
what
already reached a
subjective.
compromise on the definition.
Yeah,
I don't think the semantics is relevant here anymore because we've already
I
agreed on
do
the
because
definition.
what I was about to say, right, is okay, if we know, right, that subjective is pretty much basically based off of thoughts and feelings, right? We came to an agreement that it's basically
Mean
that, yes.
without yes, mean that without anyone to act upon their feelings, this thing would not exist.
Say it again.
Okay, so what your definition really means is that without anyone, right, or
Yeah.
without feelings or thoughts existing, this thing would also not exist, right? That's
No, no,
what
no, no,
subjective
no, no,
means.
no. I'm just saying that subjective is based off of that single little person. Let's say
You're saying
we had a
that is subjective. Wait a second. So you're saying that is subjective is that which is grounded by our feelings and thoughts?
our own feelings and thoughts, meaning no influence inherently based upon it. So if I have the feelings of
So let me just ask you the question once more. So under your worldview, your definition of subjectivity is that which is based or grounded or justified by what appears to be the case from your perspective.
from one's own perspective or thoughts or feelings.
Yeah, that doesn't work because you'd have to bite the bullet and say the law of gravity is not objective.
That's fine. I just think it's objective in my own thoughts or feelings, but it can
But
still be
if you I don't,
wrong to somebody
hey,
else.
dude, this is if you contradiction, the way you
I can't hear you. You keep on cutting out. I
I'm
don't
not
know.
finished.
Is,
Why don't you know this through some neurological events which interprets the external world to represent some law of reality which implies gravitational matter existing, right? That's just how we know this thing. We know this thing based on some thought processes, some perceptual system of appearances, right? However, regardless of this thing, regardless of us justifying this thing existing based on our thoughts, this thing is objective. So obviously there's a contradiction within your worldview. Subjective can't be based, or rather, you can't define that which is subjective as that which is justified or based on what we think to be the case. Because if that was to be true, right, then the law of gravity, which is based or justified by thought processes, would also have to be subjective under your worldview, but you don't believe it to be subjective. You believe it to be an objective fact of reality. So you'd have to bite the bullet and concede, or rather drop the point and say that the law of gravity is subjective, or you'd have to you have to admit that there's a contradiction in their worldview and refine your definition to a more suitable definition of what is subjective from what is objective.
so I couldn't hear everything you said because you were cutting out a little, which is what I was trying to tell you. But what I'm saying, right? Or let me reinstate what I meant by what I believe for gravity to be objective. Right? I just believe in my own personal worldview that it is objective. Doesn't mean necessarily to anybody else that it isn't subjective or that somebody else's own thoughts or feelings can't, attack what I'm
Saying
saying.
that your
For
belief
example,
system is contradictory.
no, I'm
Yeah,
saying
I'm saying
that
to your belief system is contradictory. You can't believe something to be subject, or sorry, you can't believe gravity to be objective. Okay, if your definition of subjective is that which is justified by personal thoughts and appearances and feelings, and the law of gravity is something that is known through a particular thought process, right? Under your worldview and your definition of what is subjective, what constitutes subjectivity, you'd also have to be saying that the law of gravity is subjective because it is known through thought processes. But you don't believe it to be subjective, you believe it to be objective. So that would mean that your definition is wrong, or rather, your definition implies some contradiction in your worldview, which is what I'm trying to point out.
not inherently. I don't think you're understanding what I'm saying.
Example.
Say
If
it
I
again?
believe that, if I believe that a rock, let's see, let me see. I'm trying to find a perfect example. Let's say I believe that a rock is like, let's say I define a rock as personal desires, right? And then there's this example where there's this thing I deem to be personal desires, but I don't deem it to be a rock. Then that obviously means that my definition of what a rock is not suffice to explaining this idea that I perceive a rock to be. Because if there's a situation where there's a personal desire which is not a rock, right? But I define a rock strictly as all personal desires, then there's a contradiction, right? In one situation, I believe a rock is all personal desires, but there's this personal desire I don't believe to be a rock, which would be the contradiction, right? So this correlates to your situation, whereas you believe that which is subjective is that which is justified or grounded in some thought processes or maybe some process of feelings. But regardless of that, there's this thing which is based on thought processes which you believe to not be subjective. That would be the contradiction in your definitional worldview of these terminologies.
I still don't think that really attacked what I'm saying. But if you want to, I
Attacks
don't
your
think like
definitional
I
usage,
think
bro.
wait. I think like I think from here, if I don't think like that really attacked what I'm saying. I think like from there then I just either win or lose. Like I don't think we have to continue. I think based off of that, what was like pretty much just discussed. Either you believe, my definition is correct, or you don't, and either way you go. Like if you go the way that you don't believe it's correct, then obviously Paula wins. If you believe what I'm saying
Hmm.
is correct, then I would win. So I don't think there's like much of a reason to continue.
Well, to sum it up, I've already explained to you, I have to agree, but I've already explained to you that the when you know something which is subjective has no effect on the actual thing which is objective, which is mind independent. The existence of something is mind independent, but the when you know the existence of something is mind dependent, it is based on some neurological processes. And I've already explained to you other things regarding morality and so on, and how science under your worldview have to be subjective if you adhere to that worldview for that reason.
Yeah. I don't think I have to sum up anything. I think mine was pretty cut and dry.
Uh,
Um. Uh. I don't think there's much anything else to say, really. That's just it. Um,
I've also already given examples of things which are moral, which are independent for desires. Like we desire a particular action, and I just don't feel as if this action is a good action. I mean, that's one example.
yeah. Um, I don't know who you wanted to judge for, like, just put it to the chat or what. Hello, Apollo.